Like and subscribe if you believe respect isn't about what someone does, but what they've been through. Especially for those who wore the uniform with pride, long after the world stopped saying their names. The sun hadn't yet breached the horizon when Elias Rower slipped into the shadowed halls of Westbridge Military Training Academy. His gray custodial uniform hung loosely on his frame, the fabric worn thin from years of quiet service. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and the lingering echo of ambition that permeated the academy's walls. Elias moved with a deliberate rhythm, his push broom gliding across the marble floors, erasing the scuff marks of cadets who hadn't yet learned the weight of their steps. His faded ball cap, stitched with the word retired above a patch few bothered to notice, sat low over eyes that had seen more than most could imagine. To the world, he was just the janitor. To him, this was home. Westbridge was a crucible of excellence, a place where young men and women from polished suburbs and storied military families came to forge their futures. They arrived with clean records, cleaner boots, and egos polished to a mirror shine, ready to command before they could properly salute. The academy's corridors thrummed with their bravado, their voices loud with the certainty of youth. They spoke of strategy, of glory, of the history they'd one day write. And Elias? He was invisible to them, a shadow who scrubbed their boot prints and emptied their trash, coffee cups and crumpled notes that fueled their dreams of greatness. They didn't see the creases in his face, the slight limp in his step, or the way his hands, rough as sandpaper, moved with a precision born of discipline. Most didn't even know his name. Some cadets mocked him. Not all, but enough to make the air heavy with their arrogance. They'd nudge each other as he passed, their laughter sharp and careless. Sergeant Mop, one called him, the nickname landing like a dart. Another, bolder, asked if he'd gotten lost on his way to the VA hospital, his tone dripping with condescension. They thought it was funny. They thought he was harmless. Elias never responded. He just kept pushing that broom, his movement steady, his silence unshaken. To the cadets, his quiet was weakness, a sign of shame. They were wrong. It was something deeper, something forged in places they'd never seen, tempered by a life they couldn't yet comprehend. The academy was steeped in tradition, its walls adorned with portraits of heroes, men and women who'd shaped history with courage and sacrifice. The Wall of Honor was its crown jewel, a gallery of black and white photographs and gleaming plaques. Elias passed it every day, his eyes sometimes lingering on one image in particular, a young officer saluting in the midst of a sandstorm, grit swirling around him like a living thing. The caption read Operation Goliath, 1978. Most cadets walked by without a glance. Elias paused, his breath steadying, then moved on. No one noticed. No one asked why. As the academy prepared for its annual symposium, a prestigious event that drew dignitaries, officers, and the promise of glory, the disrespect grew sharper. The cafeteria, a hive of chatter and clinking trays, became a stage for cruelty. Landon Hayes, a second-year cadet with a drawl as smooth as his swagger, was the ringleader. Tall, broad-shouldered, and quick with a grin, he carried himself like he'd already earned a star on his shoulder. One morning, as Elias passed with his cart, Landon accidentally knocked over his tray. Eggs, toast, and orange juice splattered across the floor like a grenade had gone off. "Oops," Landon said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Looks like we got a mess, soldier." The word dripped with mockery, and the room erupted in snickers. Elias didn't flinch. He met Landon's gaze for a fleeting moment, nodded slowly, and bent to clean the mess. His movements were calm, deliberate, as if the chaos was just another mission. The laughter grew louder, feeding on itself. Other cadets joined in, tossing napkins, spilling coffee, one even dropping a banana peel like they were in a slapstick comedy. Through it all, Elias worked, his broom a quiet metronome against their noise. To them, he was nothing, a man with a mop in a world of stars and stripes. They didn't know he'd seen worse than their taunts. They didn't know he'd survived hells they couldn't imagine. the disrespect wasn't just the cadets' doing. The academy, for all its talk of honor, had forgotten its roots. Instructors, too busy shaping the next generation of leaders, turned a blind eye to the mockery. The institution itself, with its polished halls and rigid hierarchy, had no place for a man like Elias. He was an afterthought, a relic of a war no one talked about anymore. The parades had ended, the medals tucked away in drawers. The world had moved on, and so had Westbridge. But Elias hadn't. He stayed, not for recognition, but for something deeper, a connection to the life he'd once led, to the men he'd lost, to the country he'd served. One night, someone left a fake application on his cart, a printout from a prank website titled Senior Custodial Commander. Under skills, they'd scrawled MOPFU and Advanced Trash Deployment. The cadets who'd left it probably laughed as they walked away. Elias found it at the end of his shift, his cart parked near the Wall of Honor. He read it, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his pocket. Then he kept working. If the cadets had seen his face, they might have noticed the faintest flicker of something, not anger, not shame, but resolve. He didn't need their approval. He'd earned something far greater, something they couldn't touch. The symposium loomed like a storm on the horizon. For weeks, the academy had been a frenzy of preparation. Cadets pressed their uniforms until the creases could cut glass. Boots were shined to a mirror finish. The Grand Assembly Hall, with its vaulted ceilings and rows of polished oak chairs, was reserved for the occasion. This year's keynote speaker was General Marcus Denning, a four-star legend whose name carried the weight of history. Denning had led elite missions across 4 continents, mentored officers who now commanded armies, and survived operations that were still whispered about in classified briefings. His presence was a coup for Westbridge, a chance for cadets to bask in the glow of greatness. The morning of the symposium, the air was electric with nerves. Cadets filled the hall, their postures rigid, their eyes darting to the double doors where Denning would enter. Officers flanked the room, clipboards in hand, ensuring every detail was flawless. Outside, Elias moved down the corridor with his cart, slower than usual. He paused at the end of the hall, adjusting his cap, his gaze drifting toward the assembly hall where voices echoed and chairs scraped. For a moment, he stood still, as if listening to a song only he could hear. Inside, the room fell silent as the doors swung open. General Denning entered, and the air seemed to shift under his presence. Tall and broad, with a calm that felt like the eye of a hurricane, he carried himself with the gravity of someone who'd seen the world's darkest corners and walked out alive. Salutes snapped in unison. Cameras clicked. The cadets stood, their chests puffed with pride. Denning nodded once, his face unreadable, and began to walk, not toward the podium, but past it. Past the brass, past the officers, past the rows of cadets staring straight ahead. He kept going, straight toward the hallway where Elias stood. The room froze. Whispers died. Every eye followed Denning as he stopped before the janitor, looked him square in the eyes, and saluted. A full, formal salute, crisp and unwavering. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Denning spoke, his voice low but clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Sir, it's an honor to finally meet you in person." Gasps rippled through the back rows. Cadets exchanged stunned glances. One dropped his program. "Sir," Denning had called him sir. Elias blinked slowly, his face unchanging, and returned the salute with a precision that spoke of decades of muscle memory. It wasn't showy, wasn't dramatic, just the quiet act of a man who'd done it under fire, in places where a mistake could cost lives. Denning turned to the room, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Before I begin," he said, "I want to recognize someone who shaped more lives than I ever could. Someone who led men into battle long before many of you were born. A man whose leadership, strategy, and sacrifice saved my life, and the lives of 212 other soldiers, during Operation Goliath." The name hit like a shockwave. Operation Goliath. The words were a myth, a ghost story told in hushed tones among senior officers. A mission so classified it was barely declassified, its details locked away in vaults. The cadets murmured, their confusion palpable. Denning's voice rose, steady and unrelenting. His name isn't carved into stone here. There are no wings or halls named after him, but there should be. You know him as the janitor. I know him as Commander Elias Rower. The air vanished from the room. Cadets froze, their faces a mix of shock and horror. Landon Hayes, the cadet who'd spilled that tray, sat pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Rower. The name was a legend, a shadow in military folklore. An officer so deep in black ops that his career was a patchwork of redacted files. Some thought he was a myth. Denning knew better. The general turned back to Elias, his voice softening. Sir, I've waited years for this moment. You saved us. You sacrificed more than anyone ever asked. These cadets, the future of our military, deserve to know who you really are. Elias didn't smile. He didn't bask in the moment. He nodded once, as if he'd always known this day would come, not because he sought it, but because the truth has a way of surfacing. The cadets were a sea of uncertainty. Some stood, unsure if they should. Others sat, their minds racing, replaying every snicker, every mockery, every moment they dismissed him. The weight of their actions settled like lead in their chests. Denning stepped closer to Elias, his voice gentle but firm. Would you share something with them, sir? Elias hesitated, his eyes sweeping the room. The cadets who'd laughed, the instructors who'd looked away, the walls that told a history without him, they were all watching now. He took a breath, then spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of a life lived in service. I'll speak, he said. Not for me, but for the ones who never made it home. The room went still, every ear straining to hear. Elias stepped forward, his presence filling the space without effort. I've seen young men break under pressure, he began. I've seen leaders fall, not because they weren't strong, but because they lacked humility. I came home not with pride in my chest, but with ghosts in my heart. I didn't return to be honored. I came here to stay close to what I loved, even if the world forgot me. His words were simple, unadorned, but they cut deep. He spoke of Operation Goliath, not the myth, but the truth. Of soldiers whose names were never etched in stone. Of the cost of leadership when the bullets stopped and the silence began. He spoke of sand in his teeth, of orders given in the dark, of men he'd carried on his back and others he'd buried in his mind. The cadets listened, some wiping tears, others staring at the floor. Instructors shifted, their own complicity laid bare. Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His truth was louder than any speech. And then, as quietly as he'd begun, he stopped. No flourish, no call for applause, just silence, heavy and profound. What happened next was unexpected. Landon Hayes stood, his face tight with shame. He looked at Elias, his voice trembling but clear. Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't know, but that's no excuse. Elias met his gaze and gave a small nod. Nothing more. Then another cadet stood, then another. One by one, the room rose, 200 future officers, their salutes crisp and silent. No one clapped. No one spoke. They stood in honor of the man they'd overlooked, the man who'd carried a broom but once carried a nation. Denning stepped aside, letting the moment breathe. Elias turned, his cap low, and walked back down the corridor, his broom leaning against his cart. He disappeared around the corner, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Respect isn't a title or a uniform. It's not a war story or a medal. It's how you carry yourself when no one's watching, how you honor those who carry the weight of sacrifice. Elias Rower was a reminder, a quiet, unshakable reminder, that the greatest heroes often walk among us, unnoticed, until the world remembers to look.